Welcome to Module 3. For all of the Black Christian parents who are taking this course, I definitely appreciate you all for even taking the time out to reflect on some of the things that we are discussing throughout the entirety of this course, from liberation theology, liberation parenting practices, cultural trauma, racial trauma, historical trauma, post-traumatic slave syndrome, and all of those things that at times they can be very overwhelming and cause a lot of introspection, reflection, and at times maybe defensiveness. But I just want to say I appreciate you for taking the time out to even dive into what it is that we are discussing. Again, this is Module 3, and we are looking at post-traumatic slave syndrome today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so that we can discuss or look at the module lecture notes. And again, this week we are looking at chapter 3 of post-traumatic slave syndrome, chapter 4 rather, of post-traumatic slave syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy. And so at this point, we've already looked at Liberation Theology by James Cone. And the point of that was to really paint the picture as to why we as Black Christians have put ourselves in this predicament, or have been put in this predicament rather, but in being put in a certain predicament because of the Eurocentric construct of theology that has been basically forced to us. We have not at large adopted liberation theology, and because of that, we have not liberated ourselves in the way that we approach parenting, the way that we approach relationships, the way that we approach work. Because if we're going to be Christians, all of our thoughts, processes, and ideologies and rationale should come from a Christian perspective, but it has to come from a Christian perspective that is rooted in liberation theology, or at least it should, if you want to be liberated people as liberated as Black Christian people. So now we're looking at post-traumatic slave syndrome and its effect and what it has done to us and how it continues to affect us. So we will talk about cultural trauma, historical trauma, racial trauma, but more so post-traumatic slave syndrome is the perpetuation of the effects, for the most part, of what slavery has done to us. And we'll dive into the technical definition that Dr. DeGruy gives us, but we want to look at this in conjunction with liberation theology. The point is to paint this picture over this course as to what it looks like to be liberated people in theology, liberated in our trauma from our traumas, and then moving forward into liberating parenting practices. So again, chapter 4 of post-traumatic slave syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy. She starts out by saying the conditions which the ancestors of African Americans were unexpectedly thrust into were familiar and inescapable. Slavery yielded stressors that were both disturbing and traumatic, exacting a wound upon the African American psyche that continues to fester. And so again, slavery had done so much to us, right? It pushed us into a place that we were again we weren't asked, we didn't ask to be slaves. And then because we were in captivity, there was so much that, as people's property that we were victim of, and a lot of that was the abuse mentally, emotionally, spiritually, um, psychologically, and all of that came with that. But because of that, we have had this wound, right? We've had this wound as a Black culture, and that's part of that shared experience of cultural trauma, as defined by Sheila Rye's role and Dr. Alexander in those cultural trauma books as well. But the biggest thing here is that we have a wound that needs to be healed. And because we have not taken those steps to acknowledge it, we continue to perpetuate those wounds to the following generations, right? And so here's what trauma does to us. Trauma's effect. People respond to trauma very differently, right? People respond to trauma very, very differently. There's this theory of fight, flight, or freeze. When people have been exposed to traumatic experiences, they either find themselves in a freeze moment where they kind of panic, right? They're stuck. It's either flight where they run, they get out of dodge, or it's fight, right? So I'm in this traumatic experience, so now I got to fight my way out of this, right? So people respond to it very differently. but more often we see people responding to trauma within the parameters of that flight, fight, or freeze, right? So post-traumatic stress disorder, right? And Dr. DeGroo's post-traumatic slave syndrome kind of is a pivot for Black folks from post-traumatic stress disorder. So post-traumatic stress disorder has criteria, and some of those criteria are stressors, so repeated or extreme indirect exposure to aversive details of events, and some of the symptoms are recurrent or involuntary intrusive memories. So some of those intrusive thoughts, right? We struggle to kind of move past some the whatever the traumatic experiences, and then just out of nowhere, we have these random thoughts of those traumatic experiences that kind of overtake us. They overwhelm us. Traumatic nightmares. We can't sleep at night because the thoughts and the memories of the traumatic experiences kind of plagues our sleep. Trauma-related thoughts or feelings. So we get that same feeling that we had when we were being traumatized. We often get that same feeling afterwards when we're experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder. There's a sense of hypervigilance, right? We're anxious. We can't we everywhere we turn, we're like looking over our shoulder, or trying to figure out if something is happening to us, or um, just trying to make sure that we're in this state of regulation, but trying to make sure that we're in a state of regulation at a puts us in a hypervigilant state because we're never sure enough. Right. And so problems with concentration, we can't focus. Dissociative amnesia. So we kind of, pull away, right? We kind of pull back a little bit and forget a lot of things. Sleep disturbance, self-destructive or reckless behavior. A lot of from what I've seen, a lot of Black people, and this is, I'm speaking specifically to Black people who have experienced, and I'll use maybe sexual trauma, right? A lot of people in the Black community who have experienced sexual trauma, from what I've seen, they have this what we call self-destructive or reckless behavior. What that looks like is, because a lot of us have been sexually traumatized, the reckless behavior that comes after that is that there's a lot of risk taking related to sex, right? But that's part of that post-traumatic stress disorder, more specifically in that avenue. But that could be, vary depending on what kind of trauma you were exposed to, what you had to deal with, and what the behaviors that followed that look like. Persistent negative trauma emotions, and then intense prolonged distress. So it's very hard for us to regulate our emotions after traumatic events. So African Americans have continued to experience trauma similar to those enslaved in the past. Slaves had more impactful trauma to their psyches than their bodies. Now, since slavery has ended, right, we still experience in our genes, in our DNA, and we'll get to that too as this particular lecture goes on. But in our genes, in our DNA, is this stress response, the trauma response. There's a trauma bond that we have with slavery, and it's embedded in who we are as a people. We didn't ask for it. We surely did not, suggest or request for it, but it's because of who we are, who our ancestors are, and what they had to deal with. Just generations after generations have been passed along, and they've been dealing with the stressors and traumatic experiences of trauma. They're still living within our bodies. And although we know that there were lashes, right, that there were beatings, and that they were just done all types of wrong, that's not even the bulk of it. The bulk of slaves, or people who were enslaved, Black people who were enslaved, most of their trauma was in their minds. It's the thinking, right? Because physically, right, you can get over a physical wound, but the mental recollection of what happened for you to get that physical wound and getting over that, that's where we struggle at, and that's for everybody in general. But for Black people whose ancestors were enslaved and had to deal with that stuff over generations and generations and generations, the psyches of us and our DNA has been traumatized, and we've passed that through. And so then we have passing down the effects of trauma, right? So behavior can be affected by events in previous generations, which have been passed through in the form of genetic memory. So again, I said it earlier, our DNA has been traumatized. And because our DNA has been traumatized, the more we reproduce as a people, we continue to um, uh, um, because we've been traumatized as the people, and because we continue to reproduce, the people that have come in generations following us have had that same trauma or traumatized DNA as well. They didn't ask for it, they weren't even there, but because it's in our DNA, it has affected us so much so that it's in our DNA, it's embedded. And it takes a lot of reworking in order for us to move past that. It's really hard, but we have to acknowledge it first, right? For what it is. So epigenetics. The legacy of trauma is reflected in our memory or reflected in many of our behaviors, our beliefs necessary for survival, but a hindrance to success. So out of our trauma response, right, that fight, flight, or freeze, the way that we react to certain things or the way that we, approach certain situations could be very, very much so centered around how we respond to trauma in general and how our ancestors responded to trauma. So let's say we had an ancestor who was enslaved, and their traumatic response was to fight. Right? If we're looking at fight, flight, or freeze, um, their response, of course, has been passed down through generations and generations. So now, for we got a whole family full of fighters. And then they wonder why black people they say like, oh, black people are so aggressive. We've always had to fight. It's like the color purple. All my life I had to fight. No, for real. All our lives we've had to fight. And you can't fault us for being fighters because we've been put in this position to where we've had to fight for our lives. That's who we've had to be historically as a people. Same thing with people who might freeze or run away, right? That's the thing. That's stuff that gets passed down through generations. We didn't just wake up one day and say, "Oh, this is my trauma response." No, something happened to us, and because something had happened to us, and that thing passed down through the rest of the generations through epigenetics. This is who I am. This is my DNA and biological makeup. Again, I wasn't there when our ancestors were enslaved. None of us were there. But because we share the same DNA with these people, this is who we are. And we have to be able to recognize that, right? We have to be able to recognize that, acknowledge it, accept it for what it is, and then paint our path to move forward, right? And so trauma is transmitted through how we learn to raise our children. And this is where we're going to paint the picture for the dissertation, the ultimate need for this class, and what it looks like for us to move forward. But trauma is transmitted through how we learn to raise our children, learned almost through our childhood experiences, right? And so the way I learned how to be a father, whether that be in a passive way or an active way, I've learned how to be a father because of the way that I was raised, whether I liked it or not, right? Some stuff we'll learn actively, right? Our moms and dads taught us how to do this particular thing as a parent. Other stuff we're like, I'm not gonna do that. I experienced that. I don't want my kids to deal with that, so I'm not going to do this. I'm gonna pivot a little bit, right? But out of traumatic experiences, and most of what we learn how to do passively as parents are the result of traumatic experiences. I don't want my kids to deal with that. Why? Because it was traumatizing to me, and I'm not going to re-traumatize my children when I know how it affected me. I know what it did to me, so I'm not going to perpetuate that to the next generations if I have something to do with it. And so most of us raise children based on the way we were raised. Parenting is part of a myriad of skills passed through generations, right? So same concept. We raise children based off the way that we were raised. And a culmination of experiences and things that we've seen or did not see or wanted to see, but just in culmination of all of those childhood events, we learn how to be parents. And if a child has an abusive parent, there is a strong likelihood that that child will grow to be abusive. Here's where we are as Black Christian parents who have continued to whoop our children, and we blamed it on Scripture, realizing that we've just taken Scripture out of context the same way the slave masters did, right? The reality of it is we have taken what we've seen, what we've known, and I'm not even gonna say that it worked because it never worked. We just didn't want to we didn't want to be in that traumatic experience. It worked. It worked because you traumatized it. What, like, come on now. How is trauma ever effective if we want to overcome something? That and that'll really preach. But how was trauma? How was initiating and perpetuating trauma ever effective if we want to overcome something? And so for parents who whoop their kids, Black parents, right? If we know that our enslaved ancestors were whooped, beat, brutalized, just done all types of wrong again, that traumatic experience, why would we want to continue to perpetuate that? Somebody make it make sense to me. And so here we have post traumatic slave syndrome defined. Post traumatic slave syndrome is a condition that exists when a population has experienced multi generational trauma resulting from centuries of slavery and continues to experience oppression and institutionalized racism today. Let that simmer. Let that simmer. Post traumatic slave syndrome is a condition that exists when a population has experienced multi generational trauma. When a population of people, black folks in this particular context, have experienced multiple as a people, multiple generations as a people have experienced this trauma resulting from centuries of slavery. And I would even push it a little further at this point because we've lived through slavery, we've lived through Jim Crow, we've lived through civil rights, and we've lived through whatever racial oppressions we've seen today. And we've just been oppressed as a people since we got here. So post-traumatic slave syndrome, again, after centuries of slavery and continues to experience oppression and institutionalized racism today. So us as a people, we continue to deal with this stuff. We continue to deal with this stuff, and those experiences, we are continuing to feel the effects of that as a people. Multi-generational trauma, together with continued oppression and absence of opportunity to access the benefits, excuse me, multi-generational trauma, together with continued oppression and absence of opportunity to access the benefits available in society, lead to PTSS. So, a generation after generation after generation, we continue to be oppressed, and we don't get the resources we need. We don't get the benefits we need to be successful in society. Then that leads us to be in this post-traumatic slave syndrome state. A syndrome is a pattern of behaviors that is brought about by specific circumstances. So again, if we've never seen different circumstances, if we've never seen different circumstances, and we've responded to those same circumstances the same way, over time and through generations, our response will remain the same. Responding to those traumatic experiences will be us in this post-traumatic slave syndrome, I wouldn't even say ecosystem, but state of mind, state frame of thought, etc. Right? This is kind of where we are. This is the experience. And so patterns of behavior in blacks as a result of PTSS. Dr. DeGrew identifies three things. We highlight those throughout the dissertation as well, but we'll look at them as in this lecture. So vacant esteem. So dealing with worth and value, the judgment we make based on our self-worth. The state of being oneself to have little or no worth in comparison to the larger population. So as black people, right, because we have experienced this post-traumatic slave syndrome, we almost we have low efficacy levels as a people. Our confidence isn't where it needs to be. And the reason that our confidence is not where it needs to be is because of the continued oppression that we've continued to experience. Again, it's a continued response to the same things that have been happening to us for generations, for centuries. Since we've gotten here, we've been oppressed, and so we've learned this behavior to respond to that oppression and that trauma. Part of that has been the vacant esteem. Slavery took our self-esteem away. And so as a people, once enslaved, slavery took our esteem away. And as a people, we reproduced over generations with no esteem. We've reproduced generations of low self-esteem black folks, right? It's absent, it's vacant at times. And or ever-present anger. One of the pronounced symptoms of post-traumatic slave syndrome, the normal emotional response to a blocked goal, which over time turns into frustration and fear of failure. For black people, ever-present anger shows up due to the racist, oppressive systems of America. They say we mad, we have a reason to be mad because y'all continue to hold resources away from us. So how do you expect me not to respond in this angry way when you keep moving the goalposts for me to be successful? So on one account, I don't feel good about myself. When I start to feel good about myself, you move the goalpost. Now you done made me mad again because now I got to work a little bit more harder to get to what success looks like for me. Over time, that's frustrating, and that frustration builds up to be angry. And again, if one angry person reproduces and that anger is in their DNA and then is in their genes, then their offspring will be angry, epigenetically speaking. Racist socialization, the adoption of the slave master's value system. At the foundation is the belief that white and all things associated with whiteness are superior, and that black and all things associated with black are inferior. James Coleman alluded to this in our last lecture. He mentioned this, right? That we've almost made it to where, like, who said that white people had to set the standard for what theology, what social classes look like, for what social economic classes look like, for what success looks like, for who said that they set the standard? But because we've been so exposed to this standard over time, and it has been pushed and perverted and pushed onto us to the point where we begin to think like, oh, that is the standard. That has to be the standard. And so because of that, when we start to accept it, we begin to be in this racial socialization state. And we've adopted that this value system that slave masters had must be the right way. It has to be the standard just over time because this is what we continue to be exposed to. And so vacant esteem, ever-present anger, and racist socialization, the effects of almost 4 centuries of legalized abuse, program enslavement, and institutionalized oppression can be seen today, and the results of post-traumatic slave syndrome, or PTSS, have impacted the lives of Black people. And so this is from chapter 5, but I'll add it as other notes rather. So from chapter 5, again, while Black people account for roughly 13% of the nation's population, we are dying at disproportionate rates. Black people have a life expectancy rate that is 5 to 7 years less than white people. This includes babies. Black people lead the nation in deaths by heart disease, diabetes, HIV, AIDS, hypertension, homicide, influenza, and pneumonia. Over time, because we've been so stressed out, stress begins to wear and tear over our bodies. And so all of the things that have been a result of our stress, right? That be sickness, illness, ailment, right? All of that gets perpetuated. And then as a people, we have these problems where it's like Black people lead hypertension rates, Black people lead cancer rate, or whatever it is. It's been passed down to us because of what we've been exposed to. We didn't ask for this, but there's a reason behind it. It's the stress. And it's the stress that the racial class systems and the racial socialization concept or component that Dr. DeGroote speaks of has been perpetuated and perpetuated and perverted and pushed towards us to make us believe it. And over time, because we've believed it, we've acted or behaved in a way that shows that we have been traumatized. And that trauma, because it doesn't just live in our behavior, it lives in our bodies. Then our genes, right? They begin to change and they begin to alter. And now, for you know it, there's hypertension running rapid, homicide running rapid because we're angry people, influenza, pneumonia, right? Diabetes, heart disease. Heart makes stress really get that anxiety, right? The symptoms of that is like that heart palpitations and your heart getting worked up. Over time, your heart get worked up too much. It's so stressful to your body. It's not normal for us to have these rushes of chemical imbalances in our bodies, and then we expect our bodies to just self-regulate. It doesn't work like that. Thank God for homeostasis because at some point it does, but overly exposing anybody to anything negative, right, will begin to take a toll on us. And here we have it that as a people, we continue to struggle with this stuff because of post-traumatic stress, post-traumatic slave syndrome. So some of the things that have come to be associated with Black culture are negative, demeaning, and harmful, such as public displays of aggression that are verbal or physical. So as a people, as a people, we're really not angry people. Black folks really are nice. I'm telling you, we like to really get along. We like to smile, but but life has made it hard for us. Society has made it, this country has made it hard for us. I'll even push the note further and say white people have made it hard for us when they continue to oppress us with their oppressive schemas, perspectives, systems, their classes. When they push that agenda, they make it hard for us. And we have to be able to acknowledge the way that that affects us mentally, emotionally, physically, right? Psychologically, and even spiritually for on a theological aspect or tip, right? It's hard. It's hard. So black people don't we can't have the what was me mentality because we didn't ask to be here. We didn't ask to be who wants to be chained and shackled up. Who wants to be have their humanity just stripped away from them and feel like they're less than another population of people. Nobody wants to do that. But over time, we've been put in these predicaments, and because of that, here we are struggling, and we're trying to paint our path, right? We're trying to map out our path and walk through it so that we can become liberated. But we have to acknowledge it. And Dr. DeGrew's work, in conjunction with Dr. James Cone's work, right, as we paint this picture and culminate it all toward the end, right, you have to be mindful of just the way that slavery, Jim Crow, civil rights era, all of that stuff has had an effect on who we are as a people, and acknowledge that we need to paint the path to move forward. All right, so this is module 3. Join me for the next lecture. I believe that's in module 4 or 5. But we will continue to look at some more of Dr. DeGrew, Dr. Stacy Patton, Dr. James Cone, and some other authors to paint the picture that we need to paint to change the perspective, to re-examine the why behind why Black Christian parents should not whoop their kids as we move forward.